When the Romans killed Cicero, they didn't just take his life, they cut off his hands, the hands that wrote speeches against tyranny. They cut out his tongue, the voice that had challenged power. Every Roman death had a message. This is what those messages meant. Case 1. Sejanus strangled and torn apart. On October 18, 31 AD, the most trusted man in Rome discovered that trust meant nothing. Sejanus had served as prefect of the Praetorian Guard, commander of the emperor's personal bodyguard. For nearly 2 decades, he had been Emperor Tiberius's closest advisor, his confidant, his right hand. Some whispered he was more powerful than the emperor himself. But Tiberius had grown suspicious. A letter arrived at the Senate, read aloud to the assembled senators. It started with praise. Then it shifted. By the end, it demanded Sejanus's arrest. The guards who had served under him dragged him from the chamber. He was strangled that same day. But that wasn't enough for Rome. For the next 3 days, the Roman mob descended on his body. They tore it apart piece by piece. They dragged his remains through the streets. His children were executed. His statues were torn down. His name was erased from public records. Rome didn't just kill Sejanus. Rome erased him. The man who had controlled the empire's security was destroyed by the very system he had built. But Sejanus was just one example. In ancient Rome, the path to power was also the path to destruction, and some deaths were designed to humiliate. Case 2. Elagabalus. On March 11, 222 AD, the 18-year-old emperor of Rome hid in a latrine. Elagabalus had ruled for 4 years. He had scandalized Rome with his religious practices, his sexual behavior, his contempt for tradition. The Senate despised him. The Praetorian Guard, the same guards who had once protected Sejanus, had turned against him. His mother tried to save him. Julia Simius wrapped her arms around her son as the soldiers broke through the door. They killed her first. Then they found Elagabalus. He was dragged from the latrine. The Praetorians mutilated his body. The accounts vary on exactly how, but all agree it was extensive. They tied what remained to a hook and dragged it through the streets of Rome. They tried to throw his body into the sewers. It wouldn't fit, so they threw it into the Tiber instead. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, ended his life hiding in a toilet, his body dumped like waste. The location wasn't an accident. It was the message. Elagabalus died in filth. But at least his death was quick. The next emperor on our list wasn't so fortunate. He had time to see his killer's face. Case 3. CARACALLA. On April 8, 217 AD, Emperor Caracalla stopped on the road to Carrhae. He had been traveling with his army, preparing for a campaign against Parthia. The journey was long, nature called. The emperor dismounted and walked to the side of the road to relieve himself. His guards kept their distance, all except one. Marcialus had served in Caracalla's personal guard. He had a grievance. His brother had been executed on Caracalla's orders. He had been waiting for the right moment. This was it. Caracalla was midstream when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. For a few final seconds, Caracalla understood. One of his own men had come to end him. The blade entered his back, just below the skull. It severed his spinal cord between the cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed before he hit the ground. The emperor, who had murdered thousands, including his own brother, died with his tunic around his ankles, killed by a guard whose brother he had executed. The symmetry was not lost on Rome. Caracalla's death was personal. A grievance settled. But the next death on our list was something else entirely. A message sent across an empire designed to mock a man's greatest weakness. Case 4. Crassus. In 53 BC, the richest man in Rome led 7 legions into the desert. Marcus Licinius. Crassus had everything: wealth beyond measure, political power, military ambition. He had crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus. He had formed the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. But he wanted more. He wanted military glory to match his fortune. He found the Parthians instead. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthian horse archers surrounded his legions. 20,000 Roman soldiers died in the sand. Crassus's son was killed. His head was thrown at his father's feet. Crassus tried to negotiate. The Parthians agreed to meet. It was a trap. In the chaos that followed, Crassus was killed. But his death was only the beginning. The Parthians knew of his legendary greed, how he had built his fortune on the suffering of others, how he had bought burning buildings just to let them burn, then purchased the land for nothing. They cut off his head. And then they poured molten gold into his mouth. The gold was not just torture. It was mockery. A message? You wanted gold? Here is your gold. Crassus had spent his life accumulating wealth. The Parthians made sure he choked on it. The Parthians mocked Crassus's greed, but they were outsiders, enemies of Rome. The next death was different. It came from within, and it was designed to destroy not just a man, but everything he had ever created. Case 5. Cicero. On December 7th, 43 BC, Marcus Tullius Cicero stretched out his neck and waited for the blade. He was 63 years old. He had been Rome's greatest orator, a lawyer, a philosopher, a senator, a consul. His speeches had shaped the Republic. His words had made and destroyed careers. For decades, his tongue had been the most dangerous weapon in Rome. Mark Antony hated him for it. Cicero had delivered the Philippics, 14 speeches attacking Antony's character, his ambition, his fitness to rule. The words had humiliated Antony in front of all Rome. When the Second Triumvirate came to power, Antony demanded one thing above all else: Cicero's name on the proscription list. The soldiers found him in his litter, fleeing south. Cicero didn't run. He looked at his killers and offered his neck. Mark Antony's orders were specific. Kill him, then bring back proof. They cut off his head. Then they cut off his hands, the hands that had written the Philippics. Then they cut out his tongue, the voice that had delivered them. Antony's wife, Fulvia, took the tongue and pierced it with her hairpin. The head and hands were nailed to the rostra, the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum, the place where Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches. They didn't just kill him, they erased everything he had been. Cicero's death was personal, a vendetta settled through symbolic destruction. But not all Roman deaths required such careful planning. Some were simply brutal, quick, and utterly without dignity. Case 6. Galba. On January 15, 69 AD, Emperor Galba was carried through the Roman Forum in a litter. He was 70 years old. He had ruled for 7 months. The Praetorian Guard, the same guards who had killed Elagabalus, who had once served Sejanus, had abandoned him for a younger rival. The soldiers found him near the Lacus Curtius, a sacred pool in the heart of the Forum. Galba watched the soldiers approach. He was old. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. He had time to understand what was about to happen. He saw the blade. The first blow knocked him from the litter. The soldiers surrounded him. One account says Galba offered his neck, like Cicero. Another says he asked them why. What had he done? They didn't answer. They just kept cutting. When they were finished, they cut off his head. Then the mockery began. Galba was bald. The soldiers couldn't carry his head by the hair, so they stuck their fingers in his mouth and eyes. They passed it around. They made jokes about his age. The Emperor of Rome, 70 years old, 7 months in power, ended as entertainment for his own guards. Galba was killed by the guards who should have protected him. But he wasn't the last emperor to die at the hands of his own household. The next death took betrayal to its most personal level. Servants turning on their master after 15 years of terror. Case 7. Domitian. On September 18, 96 AD, Emperor Domitian woke up afraid. He had reason to be. For 15 years, he had ruled Rome through fear. He had executed senators on suspicion. He had banished philosophers. He had terrorized his own household, his servants, his freedmen, his wife's attendants. Everyone around him lived under the threat of death. Now they had decided it was his turn. The conspiracy included his chamberlain, his steward, and, according to some accounts, his own wife, Domitia. The people he had terrorized for 15 years became his executioners. A servant named Stephanus approached him with a list of supposed conspirators. Domitian reached for it. Stephanus pulled a knife. The first blow struck Domitian in the groin. It severed his femoral artery, one of the largest blood vessels in the human body. Without pressure, he had 2 to 3 minutes before blood loss would take his consciousness. Domitian spent those minutes fighting. He wrestled Stephanus to the ground, gouging at his eyes. More servants rushed in, not to save him, but to finish him. They stabbed him 7 more times. The emperor, who had made his household fear him, died on his bedroom floor, killed by the people who dressed him, fed him, and waited on him every day. The closer to power, the closer to the blade. Domitian's servants killed him out of fear, but the final death on our list created something Rome had never seen before: an empire for sale, and a lesson that power itself was the real killer. Case 8. Pertinax. On March 28, 1930. AD, Emperor Pertinax tried to talk his way out of death. He had ruled for 86 days. He had inherited an empire in crisis, empty treasury, undisciplined army, a Praetorian guard accustomed to bribes. He tried to restore order. He cut expenses. He reduced the guard's privileges. They killed him for it. When the soldiers broke into the palace, Pertinax didn't run. He walked toward them. He tried to reason with them, to remind them of their oaths, their duty, their honor. A soldier named Tausius threw the first spear. They cut off Pertinax's head and mounted it on a lance. Then they carried it through the streets of Rome, not in mourning, but in celebration. And then they did something Rome had never seen before. They auctioned the empire. The Praetorian Guard stood on the walls of their camp and announced that the throne of Rome was for sale. The highest bidder would become emperor. 2 men competed. Didius Julianus won. He paid 25,000 sesterces per soldier, more money than most Romans would see in a lifetime. 66 days later, he was dead, executed by the Senate, replaced by Septimius Severus. The cycle of violence that had claimed Pertinax continued for generations. The cycle never stopped. The empire that had conquered the known world could not protect its own rulers from the men sworn to serve them. Remember what I said at the beginning? Every Roman death had a message. Now you've seen them. Crassus's greed, mocked with gold. Cicero's voice, silenced forever. Domitian's terror, answered by his own servants. And through it all, one pattern: the closer to power, the closer to the blade. These weren't random acts of violence. They were statements, warnings. And 2,000 years later, we're still watching the same pattern play out. In politics, in business, in every place where power concentrates. Now you don't just know what happened, you understand why. If this changed how you see Roman history, subscribe. I break down more stories like this, where the real horror isn't just what happened, but what it meant. In Rome, the closer to power, the closer to the blade.